What if I told you that the person who keeps blaming you for everything is actually running from their own shadow? That the real troublemaker isn't the one who speaks up, but the one who lives inside the unconscious cycle Carl Jung warned us about a century ago. They say you overreact, too sensitive, too dramatic, too emotional. But you know, deep down, that what you felt was real. The sting of their words, the twist in your stomach when they dismissed your pain, the quiet panic when they pretended nothing happened. You ask yourself, am I the problem? You replay the conversation again and again, looking for clues, for evidence that maybe, just maybe, you were too much. But something inside you resists, a quiet knowing, a whisper. No, you were just honest. Carl Jung once said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But what he also knew, what many never want to face, is that not everyone wants that understanding, because to face what irritates us means facing our own darkness. Most people aren't ready for that, so they do something else. They flip the script. They cast themselves as calm, rational, and fair, and you, the one who voiced your hurt, becomes the disruptor, the unstable one, the villain in the story they urgently need to believe. Why? Because to see your pain clearly would mean they have to see what caused it, and if they're the one who caused it, then the mirror turns inward, and for many, that's a place they've been running from their entire lives. This is where Jung's concept of the shadow begins to show itself. Not as an abstract idea, but as something alive, moving, speaking, controlling, through the mouths of those closest to us. When someone projects their shadow onto you, it doesn't look like darkness. It looks like blame. It looks like subtle ridicule. It looks like defensiveness disguised as logic. And sometimes it looks like silence so loud, it leaves you gasping for emotional air. The truth is, they're not reacting to you. They're reacting to the part of themselves they can't look at, but saw reflected in your voice, your tears, your truth. And instead of facing that, they made you carry it. This isn't just immaturity, it's a psychological pattern Jung observed over and over again. He called it shadow projection, the unconscious habit of casting our inner flaws onto those around us, so we never have to deal with them ourselves. It's not your weakness that unsettled them. It was your honesty, your clarity, your refusal to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. They weren't disturbed by chaos, they were disturbed by truth. And so, they blamed you. Not because you caused the pain, but because you revealed it. You didn't provoke their darkness. You only exposed what was already there. And in a world where most people are married to their masks, nothing is more threatening than someone who sees behind them. But don't worry, this isn't the end of the story. In fact, it's where the real journey begins. It starts with something small, a passing remark, a sideways glance, a joke that stung a little too sharply. But when you pause, when you look up and say, "Hey, that hurt," they laugh. Or worse, they sigh. You're overthinking again. Don't be so sensitive. God, you take everything so seriously. And in that moment, that small, quiet fracture, the truth gets erased. Not their truth, yours. You were simply reacting to something real. Your nervous system was telling you the truth, but instead of repair, you're met with gaslight, denial wrapped in performance, blame cloaked in indifference. And then it begins, the rewriting of the story. You're no longer the one responding to pain. You're now too reactive. Hard to deal with. The emotional one. This is the moment most people miss. But Carl Jung didn't. He saw it clearly. He understood that behind these subtle reversals, the minimization of your feelings, the quiet reframing of reality, there's something much deeper happening. It's not about you. It's about them. Because the person who wounded you remembers exactly what they said. They remember the tone, the look on your face, the moment you went quiet. They saw it all. They felt the shift. But instead of moving toward reflection, they took a different route, a faster, easier, unconscious one. They projected. Jung called it shadow projection, the act of unconsciously disowning the parts of ourselves we find unacceptable and casting them onto others. It's not a choice, it's a reflex, a psychological maneuver to escape shame and responsibility. And the fastest way to project a shadow is to paint the wounded as the aggressor, to label the truth-teller as the problem. Suddenly, you're the one who needs to calm down. You're the one being difficult. You're the one who can't take a joke. They act like nothing happened because to acknowledge it would mean acknowledging their impact, and to do that would shatter their internal narrative, that they are the kind one, the harmless one, the good one. So they dismiss, they deflect, they disappear, all while you stay up at night, replaying every detail, trying to find where you went wrong. But what if you didn't go wrong? What if your only mistake was telling the truth? This is the insidious nature of psychological projection. It convinces the one in pain that they're the one causing it. And here's where it becomes even more painful. The closer you are to someone, the more likely you are to become the target of their projection. Why? Because intimacy threatens the illusion. You see too much. You hear the tone others miss. You remember what they said last week, even when they try to revise it today. And that makes you dangerous, not because you are, but because your presence invites accountability. Carl Jung saw this pattern in his patients, in relationships, in families, in society. When the shadow is not integrated, it becomes a weapon. And often, that weapon is pointed straight at the one person brave enough to name the wound. So if this has happened to you, if someone hurt you and made you feel like you were the one at fault, hear this. You are not crazy. You are not too much. You are not broken. You were the mirror. And they weren't ready to look. Every person you meet carries within them a secret landscape, a territory they rarely visit, much less reveal. This landscape is not lit by sunlight, but by memory, regret, resentment, shame, and denial. Carl Jung called this the shadow, not because it's evil, but because it exists in the dark, in the places of the psyche we refuse to illuminate. The shadow is formed the moment we learn that certain emotions are bad: anger, envy, neediness. The moment we're told, "Don't be like that," we bury a part of ourselves, and over time that pile grows. It grows so big, in fact, that we start to forget what we even put down there. But forgetting doesn't mean it disappears. No, it waits, it lingers, and it leaks, not in isolation, but in relationship. You see, the unconscious mind is clever. When a person refuses to face what's inside them, they unconsciously seek out someone else to hold it. That someone is often you. You become the emotional container, the dumping ground, the mirror. Why you? Because you care, because you listen, because you feel deeply and you're not afraid to speak uncomfortable truths. That makes you dangerous to someone who's built their life around emotional avoidance, because your very presence invites a confrontation they've spent years running from. When you reflect back what's real, the hurt, the contradiction, the unspoken pain, they don't see insight. They see threat. And the ego, when threatened, does not surrender. It attacks. You're making things up. Why do you always have to start a fight? I never said that. You must be confused. Sound familiar? These aren't simple misunderstandings. They're defense mechanisms, automated scripts from a psyche determined to keep the shadow hidden. Jung knew that projection is strongest where the shadow is most repressed. So the more someone denies their capacity for harm, the more likely they are to accuse you of being harmful. The irony, the things they accuse you of, are often the very things they do themselves. They say you manipulate, but they gaslight. They say you're angry, but it's their rage seething under the surface. They say you're unstable because your clarity exposes their chaos. And slowly, you begin to question your own perception. Maybe I am too intense. maybe I do need too much. Maybe it is me. No, it's not you. It's not that you are the shadow. It's that you reflected it. And mirrors are only dangerous to those who fear what they might see. Jung taught that every soul must eventually turn inward. But until then, the unexamined shadow will find ways to survive, and projection is its favorite disguise. This is why the closer you are to someone, the more you feel the burn. Because proximity makes you a mirror, and the more clearly you reflect, the more desperately they need to shatter the glass. Not because you've harmed them, but because you see them. And to be seen, truly seen, is unbearable for a self built on denial. So they rewrite the story. You become the villain, and they walk away, vindicated. But here's what they don't realize. You weren't trying to hurt them. You were offering a chance to awaken. Because the mirror doesn't lie, it only shows what is. And just because they turned away, doesn't mean you were wrong to hold it up. Some people wear their lies so beautifully they begin to believe them, not the obvious ones, not the big, scandalous deceptions, but the quiet, polished illusions they've built to survive, the illusion of being the nice one, the peacemaker, the emotionally stable one, the one who never yells, never causes drama, never hurts anyone. Carl Jung had a name for this construct, the persona, the mask we wear in the theater of life, to appear acceptable, to be liked, to fit in. But what most people don't realize is that this mask isn't just for the world, it's also worn for the self. They don't just pretend to be good. They believe they are good because they've banished every unacceptable part of themselves into the unconscious. The shadow carries the rage, the envy, the pride, the selfishness, so the persona can shine untouched. And what happens when you, with your inconvenient truth, your raw honesty, your trembling but brave voice, step into their world? You threaten that delicate illusion. Because persona is fragile. It's not who they truly are. It's who they need to believe they are. And the moment your truth rubs up against that facade, the whole thing begins to crack. Not because you're trying to destroy anything, but because truth has a frequency. And when it enters the room, everything that's false begins to tremble. So what do? They protect the mask, not the relationship, not your heart, not even the truth, only the mask. This is why, when you speak up, you don't get understanding. You get defense, you get silence, or you get a role assigned to you, the troublemaker, the overreactor, the unstable one. It's not personal, it's structural. You see, when you confront someone living inside their persona, you don't just question their behavior, you threaten their entire self-concept. Because behind the mask is chaos they've refused to meet. Jung called this the provisional life, a life built not on authenticity, but avoidance. A life lived in roles, in performances, in convenient stories. Not because they're evil, but because they're terrified. Terrified of who they might be without the mask. Terrified of the feelings they buried long ago. Terrified of how much damage they've caused in their unconscious sleepwalking. And so when you say, "This hurt me," they don't hear your pain. They hear a threat. Because for them, your truth isn't just information, it's annihilation. So they activate their defenses. They minimize. They shift the subject. They disappear. They gather allies who'll mirror the mask back to them. They perform serenity while you spiral in confusion. It's not because they don't understand. It's because understanding would cost them too much. And yet, here's what most people never see. Behind every rigid persona is a wounded child. One who learned early that being real was dangerous. One who found safety in performance. And now, as an adult, they mistake emotional honesty for attack. But that's not your burden to carry. You didn't create the mask. You didn't build the illusion. You only brought truth into a space where it was not welcome. And for that, you were labeled the problem. But Carl Jung reminds us, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, And that's the war you've walked into. Not a war against you, but a war against the self they refuse to face. So the next time someone silences your truth to protect their persona, remember, you're not too much. You're just too real for a world still hiding behind its own mask. There's a kind of silence that heals, the silence of stillness, of reflection, of sanctuary. But then there's another kind, a silence that cuts deeper than words ever could, a silence that arrives not to soothe, but to dominate. You know the one. It's the silence that comes after you finally speak your truth. After you say, "This hurt me." After you name the fracture, the wound, the unspoken tension, and instead of dialogue, you get nothing. No reply, no acknowledgement, no attempt to repair. Just silence. It's easy to mistake this as passivity, as if they've withdrawn to cool off, to process. But Carl Jung saw it for what it really is: strategy. When someone lives inside their persona, that carefully constructed false self we spoke of, and they're confronted with emotional truth, they don't engage. Because engagement threatens exposure. Instead, they retreat into silence. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they know that silence speaks loudest when wielded as a weapon. Silence, when used this way, becomes psychological warfare. It flips the burden of guilt back onto you. Suddenly, you're the one wondering, did I say too much? Was I too intense? Maybe I should have been quieter, softer, more careful. And just like that, you begin to shrink. This is what Jung called the unconscious power dynamic, a state where the emotionally avoidant person gains power not by overpowering you, but by withholding what your nervous system desperately needs: connection. You see, we are wired for repair. Our biology is built to seek resolution. When a rupture happens in a relationship, our minds need coherence. But when the other person goes silent, you're left alone in the rupture. And in that space, confusion grows. You begin to replay the entire relationship in your mind. You search for clues. You overanalyze every word, every tone, every moment. And in doing so, you abandon yourself, all in the name of trying to understand them. But this isn't confusion. This is control. The silence isn't a lack of communication, it is the communication. It says, "You don't matter enough to be answered. I refuse to meet you in your humanity. If you want peace, you'll have to come find me and leave your truth behind." And because you're someone who values connection, who wants healing, who believes in talking it through, you might just chase that silence. You might offer one more explanation, one more apology, one more softened version of your pain. But the more you chase, the more power they gain. Because the moment you abandon your voice to keep the connection, you abandon yourself. Jung understood that this kind of dynamic doesn't just hurt, it fragments the self. Because the wounded part of you knows the truth. But the abandoned part of you is still waiting for their response. And here's the most painful part. The longer they stay silent, the more grateful you'll feel for even a breadcrumb of attention. A text, a like, a vague, impersonal message weeks later. And in that moment, you'll feel relief. Not because the relationship is healed, but because your nervous system is starved. This is emotional dependency, not built through closeness, but through absence, through the kind of silence that conditions you to abandon your truth in exchange for scraps of approval. But here's what you must remember. You don't owe your voice to someone who can only tolerate your silence. You don't have to explain your pain to someone who benefits from not understanding it, and you don't have to keep knocking on the door of someone who only opens it when they need control. As Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And who you truly are doesn't need to beg for acknowledgement. You are not too much. You are not unstable. You are simply someone who refuses to pretend anymore. And in a world addicted to masks and manipulation, that kind of truth will always make people uncomfortable. Let's say it out loud now, what your heart has been whispering all along. You were never the problem, you were the mirror. And that terrified them. Because when a person has spent their life avoiding their own reflection, the one who sees them clearly becomes the enemy. Not because you've judged them, but because you didn't play along with their script. You didn't pretend it didn't hurt. You didn't swallow your words to keep the peace. You didn't let the lie live comfortably in the silence. You saw it, and you named it. And in doing so, you became dangerous. Not maliciously, but simply because truth is threatening to those who've built an identity around avoidance. Carl Jung wrote, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." You didn't make the wound grow. You revealed the wound that was already pulsing beneath their smile. You weren't too intense. You were just unwilling to pretend. You didn't cause the fracture. You simply stopped taping over it. That's why they flipped the narrative. That's why they turned the spotlight onto you. Because it's easier to label you as difficult than to admit that they've been emotionally absent. It's easier to make you feel guilty than to sit with the shame of how they dismissed your pain. And so, they create a version of the story where you are to blame. You're unstable. You're over-emotional. You're always starting something. And slowly, you begin to wonder, what if they're right? But that's the trap. The moment you internalize their projection, you abandon your truth, and they get to stay comfortably unconscious. It's not an accident. It's a pattern. Jung called this psychic inflation, when a person's ego becomes so swollen, so fragile, that any challenge to their self-image is treated as an existential threat. And you? You became the threat. Not because you wanted to fight, but because your presence demanded depth. You asked for honesty, you asked for accountability, you asked for emotional reciprocity, and when they couldn't give it, they punished you for asking. But here's the truth. People who fear their own reflection will always attack the mirror. They'll call it cracked. They'll say it distorts. They'll cover it, ignore it, smash it if they can. Because the mirror holds them accountable. You were never asking for too much. You were asking for what they weren't willing to give. Truth, clarity, responsibility, repair. And that's not your flaw. That's your strength. So if someone keeps blaming you for their discomfort, keeps rewriting history to preserve their innocence, keeps making you feel guilty for having feelings, step back. Not because you're weak, but because you're wise. Because you've realized that some people aren't looking for healing, they're looking for protection from their own unfinished business. And you? You were never the source of their pain. You were just the light that made it visible. Let that truth settle into your bones. You didn't break them. You just stopped holding together the version of themselves they refused to take responsibility for. That doesn't make you cruel. That makes you clear. And clarity is the beginning of liberation. We all carry a secret hope that if we just explain ourselves the right way, if we say it calmly enough, softly enough, lovingly enough, the other person will finally understand. That they'll wake up, that they'll say, "You're right. I see now. I'm sorry." But Carl Jung knew the truth. He saw it in thousands of therapy sessions, in myths and dreams, in the hearts of people shattered by those they loved. And what he discovered is this: you cannot awaken someone who is committed to sleeping. It doesn't matter how loud your truth is. It doesn't matter how much pain you show them. If they are not ready to face their own unconscious, they won't. Not because they don't hear you, but because they can't afford to feel what hearing you would awaken in them. Because to truly hear you would mean confronting the wreckage they left behind, the unkept promises, the subtle manipulations, the silences that spoke volumes, the love they claimed, but never backed with action. Jung called this the refusal of consciousness, a psychic state where the ego becomes so rigid, so defended, so intoxicated with its own innocence, that any confrontation with reality is experienced as betrayal. And so they sleep, not with closed eyes, but with open ones that refuse to look inward. They go to work, they post cheerful things, they make small talk, and they tell others that you were the problem. Meanwhile, you're awake at 2 a.m., replaying every word, every moment, wondering what else you could have said to make them see. But here's what you need to know. You were never speaking to the awake version of them. You were speaking to the persona, to the mask, to the fortress they built to keep their shadow locked away. And that fortress, it doesn't have doors, only mirrors, only smoke. No matter how much love you pour into that space, it will never bloom. Because love doesn't grow in illusion, it only grows in truth. So Jung offered a different path. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. He meant this not just for them, but for you. Because staying in that dynamic, explaining, begging, hoping, waiting, is its own kind of sleep. The sleep of self-abandonment. The sleep of waiting for someone else to grow so that you don't have to walk away. But you deserve more than crumbs, more than half attention and fake apologies, more than being seen as the villain for having emotional depth. You deserve reciprocity, integrity, someone whose soul meets yours, not just their story of themselves. And that begins when you accept the hardest truth of all. They may never wake up. They may never apologize. They may never see the damage they caused. They may go on pretending they did nothing wrong because that illusion feels safer than change. But that doesn't have to stop your healing, because their unconsciousness is not your responsibility. Their refusal to awaken is not your failure. And your worth, your voice, your truth, it was never up for debate. You do not need their understanding to be whole. You do not need their remorse to move forward. You only need this one decision to stop waiting at the doorstep of someone else's awakening and turn fully toward your own. Somewhere along the way, you began to wonder, maybe it's me. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I really do cause all this chaos. But no, you weren't the chaos. You were the clarity. You were the first one in the room willing to say, this isn't working. This doesn't feel right. This needs to be named. And that's not dysfunction. That's discernment. Carl Jung taught us that healing begins not with perfection, but with the courage to see, to look directly at what others turn away from, to bring light into the corners of the psyche where pain hides in silence. You did that. You noticed the double meanings, the small dismissals, the emotional absence dressed up as calm. You noticed how the story didn't add up, how the apology never arrived, how your truth became the crime. And instead of numbing it down, instead of shrinking yourself to stay in the story, you faced it. You walked into the storm, not because you wanted drama, but because you refused to keep living in denial. And for that, you were labeled the problem. But you weren't. You were the mirror. You were the one with eyes still open, the one with a nervous system that refused to normalize chaos, the one who broke the cycle of silent suffering. That's the role the unconscious fears the most, the witness, because once someone sees clearly, the spell is broken. Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. You were never searching for perfection. You were searching for integration, for something or someone who could sit in the truth with you, who wouldn't flinch at the shadow, who wouldn't run from their part in the pain. But they weren't ready, not because you asked for too much, but because they've given too little, for too long. They mistook your standards for criticism. They mistook your honesty for attack. They mistook your depth for danger. And maybe that broke your heart. But it didn't break you. Because the most powerful thing you did was not walking away from them. It was walking back to yourself. You stopped asking someone else to validate your truth. You stopped trying to be heard by ears that were never trained to listen. You stopped explaining your feelings to someone who was invested in misunderstanding them. And you started choosing silence. Not their silence, but your own kind. The kind that feels like clarity, like peace, like finally coming home. So, no, you're not broken. You're not too much. You're not the villain. You're the one who saw what no one else would face. You're the one who chose consciousness over comfort. And that is the beginning of freedom. Because once you stop trying to awaken those who refuse to wake, You begin to attract those who are already alive. People who want to understand, people who can sit in discomfort without collapsing, people who don't hide behind persona, but who've met their shadow and learned to hold it with grace. That's what you're making space for now. Not revenge, not resentment, but resonance. A life where your voice doesn't echo into silence. A love where your truth is met with truth. A world where you don't have to explain your humanity to be seen as worthy of it. Jung called this the individuation process, the sacred journey of becoming who you truly are. You're already walking it, and everything that hurt you along the way was not proof that you were unworthy. It was proof that your soul refused to settle. It was proof that your vision was clear, even when others refused to open their eyes. So now, the choice is yours. Not to awaken them, but to keep awakening you. Not to change their path, but to walk yours with truth, clarity, and peace. You've done enough explaining. You've earned your liberation. Now walk it, as someone who sees, who feels, who chooses to be free. In a world flooded with surface-level interactions, fast-paced communication, and curated images of positivity, Carl Jung's teachings offer something rare, depth, something honest, something that doesn't shy away from the mess of being human. If you've ever found yourself in a relationship, romantic, familial, professional, where you were cast as the problem for simply feeling, for asking questions, for noticing the cracks no one else dared mention, know this. You weren't wrong for seeing clearly. You were awake in a system designed for sleepwalkers. Modern life rewards performance. The more agreeable you are, the more you're praised. The more silent you stay about discomfort, the more people call you easygoing. But Jung reminds us, your soul isn't here to perform. It's here to individuate. In practical terms, this means you're allowed to set boundaries without guilt. You can walk away from people who use silence as a weapon or twist your emotions into something shameful. You don't have to over-explain your truth just to make someone else comfortable. You're allowed to value depth over harmony, because not all peace is honest, and not all silence is spiritual. Start noticing when you're being pulled into someone else's projection. Is the story they're telling about you really about you? Or is it a way to escape their own shadow? Instead of trying to fix their discomfort, redirect your energy inward. Ask, what does my discomfort want to teach me? This is the essence of shadow work, turning away from blame and towards self-awareness. And if you're someone who deeply feels, who often ends up seeing too much, Jung's wisdom asks you not to suppress that gift, but to steward it with discernment. Not everyone is meant to witness your truth, but you are. As you walk through your own healing journey, here's the real task. Not to convince others of your worth, not to make the unconscious conscious in them, but to become radically conscious within yourself, because your energy is sacred. Your boundaries are a form of truth, and your inner clarity is more powerful than anyone else's confusion. The world doesn't need more people who smile through suppression. It needs more people like you, people who have seen the shadow and still choose to love, who have been projected onto yet still choose self-respect, who refuse to carry what is not theirs, and in doing so, finally walk free. If this message resonated with your journey, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this video. Your support helps us bring more Jung-inspired content to those who need healing, clarity, and the courage to walk their own truth. Let's keep awakening. Together. Pukal.